Welcome everybody once again to this event. Once again, thanking our sponsors Raytheon and thanking everybody for being here. For those of you I have not met, I'm Josh Rovner. I'm the new Tower Chair in International Politics and National Security at the Tower Center for Political Studies. And I'm a recent arrival at SMU. I've been here about 2 months now, and I'm absolutely loving it. And I'll tell you why I'm loving it. Because events like this are a tribute to what's going on at SMU, a place which is taking seriously international politics and national security education for undergraduates. This is pretty rare these days in American academia, and SMU has really made a serious commitment, and the Tower Center and the legacy of Senator Tower is very important here, so it's fantastic. That's who I am. I hope I get a chance to meet everybody else. Please continue to enjoy your dessert, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. The conference is about the nexus between political and budget realities in Washington, strategy, national security, and the nuts and bolts of the defense industry. How do we actually buy the things we need, and where do we send them, and how do we do these things in a period of budget austerity, when money, for the first time in a long time, is starting to get tight? Nobody knows these issues better than our keynote speaker. Nobody has been so close to these worlds as Gordon England, who is the president of E6 Partners LLC, which specializes in defense security and mergers and acquisition for defense and international companies. Prior to his work at E6, Mr. England was the 29th Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Navy, and the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. He's had a remarkable career, both in government service and in industry. I can't read the whole bio. You have it in front of you. It's too long to read, but you'll see a couple of things about it. And in addition to his government service and his long and distinguished career in industry, he's a civic and community leader. He has served as a city councilman. He's been the vice chair of the National Board of Goodwill International and on the USO's Board of Governors and the Defense Science Board, and so on and so on. This is truly somebody who's been at the forefront, both in terms of civic and community life and defense and government service. And it's my great pleasure to welcome the Honorable Gordon England.
So Josh, thank you. For everyone who's eating, I'm not intimidated by knives and forks and all that, so please, please finish your dinner, and you can just listen in background. Josh, thanks for the warm and generous introduction. I asked Jim what I should speak about tonight, and he said speak about 20 to 30 minutes, and 25's perfect, so it's going to be about 25 minutes, so if you'll bear with me for about 25 minutes. I learned a lot from Julius Caesar. You know, Julius Caesar was a great general, and he also gave very long speeches, and they killed Julius Caesar. So I am going to stick to my 25 minutes. Now, first I want to tell you, be forewarned, what you see is what you get tonight. When I was Secretary of the Navy, if you're a Secretary of the Navy, your office is on the 4th floor, the 4th deck of the Pentagon. And when I moved from Secretary of the Navy to Deputy Secretary of Defense with Secretary Rumsfeld, you move from the 4th deck to the 3rd deck, okay, the 3rd floor. A lot of civilians on the 3rd floor. Of course, Navy's on the 4th floor. So when I moved from the 4th to the 3rd floor, some wag in the Navy said that when I moved to the 3rd floor, it raised the average IQ of both floors. But I never shared that with Secretary Rumsfeld, right? Okay, now in China there's a saying that when a person assumes a new position, they must light 3 fires. So I use that as guidance when giving a talk, and so you'll notice that I have basically 3 subjects tonight, hopefully melded a little bit. So tonight I'm going to make 3 points. And a little bit different. I'm not going to give you international, country by country. I'm going to try to give you a little bit different perspective and maybe a few different ways to think about international and national security and about the U.S. role in the world. First, however, I'd like to make a lighthearted, sort of what tongue-in-cheek remark about it, what is generally referred to as the Washington, dysfunctional Washington. I guess you did see, all this controversy about the Washington Redskins. You heard that story, right, about demeaning and all that. They fixed that problem, right? They have dropped the name Washington. It's now just the Redskins, right? So, okay, so now here's a thought. So, sort of, again, a lighthearted thought to start the evening. Aside from all the contentious ideological and fiscal differences that plague our national leadership, there is now a unique leadership situation in Washington. So based on a cursory view, but I believe it's right, you may not have thought about this, but I believe for the first time in the history of the Republic, turns out the 4 top positions in the federal government, President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, they're all held by former senators. We now have 4 former senators in the 4 top positions. I think that's the first time ever. And maybe that's not significant, except one thing you need to know. First of all, if you're a senator, you don't run anything except maybe a committee, right? Well, fact, not a criticism, fact. Run a committee, maybe 20 people. Now, all of a sudden, we have 4 ex-senators running 4 hugely complex organizations, one the nation, and the rest are pretty, significant. And so that's sort of meaningful, and plus the House, frankly, there was always sort of an animosity between the House and the Senate, and now I think that's probably spread across the whole government. So interesting to think about. Okay, and also the Texas legislature. If you're from Texas, you know this. If you're not, you may not know this, but in Texas, the legislature meets every other year, right? Every other year. I tell people the good news in Texas is they meet every other year, so they only do half the damage to the state. Well, and there's a little bit of truth to that, frankly, and so a little bit of gridlock in Washington may not be too bad if you have just some gridlock. The problem that you have in Washington right now is that we've gone 4 years, maybe 5, without a budget. And you heard, I guess, my Raytheon friends say, we not only don't have a budget, you have the uncertainty of sequestration, you have continuing resolutions, and so the DOD, frankly, they have a lot of multi-year commitments, so they're really living in financial chaos. And this, it's literally week to week, month to month, not a way to run basically a $500-600 billion organization. Now, I do think they could and should do better, but that's another whole story. So if you take our sort of financial situation, now you overlay it with, all these issues and no budget and sequestration, all that, that does have security ramifications here and abroad. So with that background, that brings me to my first fire, or my first point. So my first point is that security and economic development are 2 sides of the same coin. You cannot have economic development without security, and long-term, you cannot have security without economic development. And I believe that's universal. It's true everywhere. So positive economic development means national and personal wealth, right? If it's positive, you're doing good. It's a good standard of living, it's good jobs, and that generally equates to stable and functioning societies. I was talking to somebody here tonight dealing in Egypt, and I think, so Egypt's just the opposite, right? Now, there is a struggle between Sunni and Shia Muslims in Egypt and elsewhere, and there's also a struggle between those who want secular governments and those who want Islamic governments. But I tend to think that the underlying issue is mainly economic and the huge social disparities that then bring forth lots of religious conflict and differences. So one of my staff in the Pentagon immigrated to the United States from Egypt at about age 20, joined the U.S. Navy, retired while he was on my staff, and then I hired him as a civilian, so he stayed on my staff, and we're still very, very close. So Hisham still has family in Egypt, so I would often get an on-the-ground perspective of life for the average Egyptian, and it has shaped my perspective, frankly, particularly of Egypt. So during the last 6 months or so of Mubarak's rule and before the overthrow, Hisham said that his elderly mom would get up 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning to stand in line for bread. Stand in line for bread. Get up early in the morning so you get bread for the day. His brother with 3 children did not have a job, so while historians will debate the issues of the influence of an emergency democracy versus a dictatorship, I tend to think that economic despair and deprivation were more at play in Mubarak's fall. And while things seem to be improving, no matter who leads Egypt, because too many people live on $2 a day, no government can long-term maintain order and stability without financial resources to build a functioning economy and a secure society. Now, unfortunately, while aid is coming in from friends like the Saudi into Egypt, investment money is leaving. And when security is questioned, money moves to a more stable place quickly. Speed of a keystroke, right? Move all your money out of the country. And by the way, I actually think it was a mistake because we're cutting our aid, quote, it's military aid, but it substitutes for economic aid there. I actually think we should be increasing aid, not decreasing aid to Egypt. Now, the classic example of my coin analogy, right, 2 sides of the same coin, is the former Soviet Union. So like me, many in this room tonight spent a goodly part of their careers as either civilians or in uniform, working to help defeat or defend the United States, and if necessary, defeat the Soviet Union. So from the end of World War II until the wall came down in Berlin in 1989, for over 40 years, the US and Russia were locked in a titanic Cold War, where each side built up massive military might. The US eventually won, but not on the battlefield. Neither side ever openly fired a shot directly against the other. Rather, the Soviet Union collapsed from within. Ultimately, Soviet economic development could not keep pace with the West. President Reagan had it right. He spent the Soviet Union into oblivion. Their military machine kept falling further behind as their economy weakened. But notably, that economic collapse was not foreseen even a year earlier. Not 1 year in advance. In fact, it's probably not even 6 months in advance that anybody ever foresee the Soviet Union was going to completely collapse economically. A more positive example of the coin analogy is a rebuilding of a devastated world after World War II. The European and Asian economies and our own recovered and thrived under the security umbrella provided by the US. US troops in Germany, they were there defending the Fulda Gap, remember this, against a possible invasion from the Soviet Union. Those troops, along with the NATO security guarantees, provided the security, a security umbrella for the economic development of Western Europe. That's why they were able to do it, because of the security umbrella that we provided. Now, deployed US troops still provide security in South Korea, Japan. By the way, we're still in Kosovo. Think about that. We have US troops in the middle of Europe to provide stability in Kosovo, in Europe. I always found it astonishing. We always wanted to pull them out, by the way, because we needed troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they're still in Kosovo. And of course, we still have them in other former and current hotspots. So the connection between economic development and security, I think, begs a few questions for us. So the question I have is the greatest threat to America internal or external? And does the American economic malaise threaten our own security, and does it threaten the security in other parts of the world? And do we have the political will, and I don't mean politicians, political will is all of us, right, because we elect all the politicians. Do we have the will to make any changes? And I think that's a really fundamental question we all should think about. Okay, now fire number 2 is culture. Culture matters. and understanding different cultures matters a lot to us. So economic development in a country is a function of culture and its economic system. A year or so ago, one of the national academies conducted a study to better understand why innovation occurs in some countries and not others. So for example, iPhone developed in the United States. Why is it that it was developed here? Why didn't some other country, right, come out with the iPhone? Here's the unexpected finding. The unexpected finding was that culture was the primary determinant of innovation. Here's an interesting point. In the study, Japan was cited as a culture that was ideally suited to the closed borders of the Cold War, but completely unsuited to the current era of borderless knowledge. So keep in mind, Japan is a closed society in what is now a very open world. Now, if you look at Japan the last 20 years, they've had pretty much a decline in a lot of their competitors, right? We don't see Sharp TVs and all the Sonys and all the things that were dominant before. So their competitiveness has indeed dropped off, and maybe that confirms the finding about culture and development, innovation. So think about Singapore, Taiwan, Israel, and South Korea. All small, quite young countries having formed after World War II, but each with a dynamic technology-based economy. Their cultures embrace technology, they embrace change, value education, and other attributes of an advanced society. Now compare those startup countries. The most established Arab countries in the Middle East have been in place much longer. Many societies in the Middle East are threatened by technology, they're threatened by change, and they're threatened by the future. Now the leadership may be enlightened, but too many of the people cope with change by clinging ever more to the past. So can you think of any product you use that is imported from the Middle East other than oil and perhaps olives or something like that? So if countries in the Middle East continue to have high population growth, and without economic development to provide jobs, and with likely declining oil wealth, particularly as ours expand, can they ever be secure? So here's an interesting dichotomy. With large population growth in underdeveloped countries, security is at risk because economic development cannot keep pace. Whereas in many advanced economies, the aging and shrinking populations will eventually weaken the security in those countries. Now, the good news about America is we're not aging and we're not shrinking. I was talking to Jim, a lot of this because we have a lot of immigration, right? God bless America. Otherwise, we'd probably be in serious trouble. People don't think about it. Without the immigration, we'd probably be in serious trouble in America. Now, by the way, research reveals that one of the best ways for societies to understand different cultures is through, you'll like this here, student exchanges, right? Followed by, you'll like this, cross-border business relationships. Military exchanges are similarly ranked, and so an interconnected world does have its advantages. By the way, politicians and political propaganda way down the list, right? People, that doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of understanding. So cultures that value technology have a huge global competitive advantage because technology is crucial to national security, economic health, well-being, and standard living. So here's an accepted way to measure technology health, and that is investment in research and development. So by this measure, about 1/3 of global investment is in the United States. Take all the money in the world, about 1/3 of it's right here in the US. Asian countries about 1/3, and the EU is about 1/3. That's all good, except that investments in Asia are growing rapidly while US R&D is declining, both private and government. And sequestration particularly hurts university research, which is where most of the basic research is in the country. And by the way, I think Wall Street Journal had an article about that today, showing the decline, and also government labs, but most basic research is in universities. And of course, they can't fill in the void, right? Uncertainty, they don't just have money sitting there, so it hurts them particularly hard. The former president of China, Hu Jintao, stated the worldwide, this is interesting, the worldwide competition of overall national strength is actually a competition for talents, especially innovative talents. The worldwide competition of overall national strength is actually a competition for talents, especially innovative talents. So how do we fare in this competition? So one measure is the number of freshmen in a four-year college program. So if you take the number of freshmen in a four-year program in China, that equals the combined number of freshmen in the United States, the EU, and Japan. So that's a lot of freshmen in China, right? I mean, our country, all of Europe, right, and Japan equals that. Now, so that's a numbers game. Doesn't speak for the quality of education. However, my university friends do tell me that the Chinese technical degrees are very competitive with the US. So they're turning out good technical people. Now, if you read Hu Jintao's comments about innovation talents to mean engineering talent, then the outlook really does cause, at least me, some worry. So if you look at the percentage of engineering graduates among all undergraduate degrees, so you take all the degrees last year in the United States, 2012, turns out in the US, 4% of those graduates were engineers. That's among the smallest national percentages in the world. In Asia, remember now, they have a lot more people in college, the number is 23%, and in the EU, the number is 13%. Now this matters. It matters because in the US, technology powers economic development, meaning future jobs, plus our military. Our whole construct of the US military is based on technical superiority, pretty important for our security. Now the US is blessed, and we are blessed, because we have a vibrant agriculture sector, and we have a growing oil and gas sector. But the future of the US and other competitive world economies will be technology-based. I mean, we cannot support a country, 320 million people, with oil and gas and agriculture. Otherwise, we're going to be pretty poor. So technical talent is the coin of the global realm. Keeping that in mind, the US secondary education system ranks 17th in reading, 32nd in math, and 23rd in science out of 65 countries, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's their latest rankings. Hey, maybe they're not perfect, but adjusted some, still the message is pretty sober. That's not encouraging for the future competitiveness of US workers in an interconnected global economy. And I can tell you, talk to people in technical enterprises, they still today have trouble finding people, even though we have massive unemployment. And by the way, before everybody's too smug, the adults rank about the same. And why would they be different, right? If the kids are about that, the adults are about ranked the same. You may not know this. You know that 1/3 of all the youth in America does not graduate from high school. 1/3 do not graduate from high school. I actually wonder how you can be a competitive nation if you have 1/3 of the population not even graduate from high school. By the way, Israelis, 92% of all Israelis have at least a high school education, and something tells me they probably have a higher scholastic level when they graduate. Now, as technology advances around the world, especially with borderless knowledge and communication, there is a wholesale diffusion of all forms of power. This diffusion empowers individuals and small groups at the expense of governments. As individuals gain access to more information and with the means to easily organize for political, business, ideological, religious, or whatever reasons, the state is weakened. The internet's power to educate citizens and organize movements comes at the expense of the state. And by the way, may come at the expense of some higher education institutions. It will be interesting to see how this diffusion of power plays out with failed or failing states from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. And by the way, we're at the very beginning of this whole information. I mean, we may think, we're well along. We're probably at the 1 percentile, right? I mean, this is just starting. So there's going to be an enormous diffusion of information as time goes on. So consider this. This is one of the more peaceful times in the history of the world. There's only one war, that's in Afghanistan, and it's winding down. Yet the level of turmoil and disturbance around the world is unusually high, including, by the way, discord here in the United States. For good or bad, this reflects, at least in part my view, to the free flow of information and the weakening of central governments and institutions. Now, governments inherently try to garner more central control. I mean, for us, think of healthcare in the United States, right? Central control of government. So, Tea Party-like organizations will become more numerous or strengthened, and I think in the future you'll probably have more discord and more stalemates. I mean, you're going to have more and more proliferation of all sorts of views and ideas. Now, there's a silver lining, at least to me. I think, quote, the power of the press, the power of the news media, and the power of governments to decide what news to put out and how to package it, right? Which I call propaganda, but if you think about it, every day, somebody in a newsroom looks at 100 things and they decide, I'm going to show these 3, and here's how I'm going to package it, right? So that's weakening, right? Because people have access to information themselves. Okay, my third fire. And it deals with a huge deficit facing the U.S. and the world. Yes, we do have the problem that each of you is likely thinking about, but the deficit I am referring to is a different and vastly more important deficit. So what I'm talking about is a deficit of leadership. And that deficit swamps every other national and international consideration. Leadership matters, especially in a world where social, scientific, political, culture, and economic issues are intertwined and often explosive. It really matters when leadership is lacking. The evil of the world loves a power vacuum. Now, world leadership is certainly in a better place than it was in the early and mid-20th century. Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Emperor Hirohito, long gone. We're certainly better than we were then. But societies are very fragile to economic conditions. I mean, Germany turned very quickly in the 30s, right? Fundamentally because of economic conditions. And leadership today seems incapable of dealing with runaway social spending literally everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere seems to be a problem. Because it's too easy, frankly, to take the national wealth and devour the investment dollars today. They should be used for generating future economic growth. It's much easier politically to put that money into programs that, quote, everybody likes. Lacking vibrant economic growth, the new red threat to national security is runaway spending and unsustainable debt. And we keep putting off necessary reductions without growth. My view is you have to have reductions in federal spending, but we're sort of like St. Augustine in his youth when he prayed, Lord, make me chaste, but not quite yet. Now, we're not Rome in the 5th century, and we're not the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but we're certainly trending into unknown and possibly treacherous waters. Too many nations are entering treacherous waters, economic waters with potentially high levels of social unrest. Global leadership also seems incapable of dealing with emerging global hotspots, like Iran developing a nuclear weapon, the Syrian civil war potentially expanding in the broader Middle East, and an unstable North Korea continuing its nuclear ambitions. Indecisive leadership breeds contempt and invites aggression. And this is especially true as we retreat from the world leadership position we've held since World War II. A weak and naive U.S. administration, eager to avoid any confrontations, is heedlessly encouraging the dysfunctional behavior that they want to discourage. So what conclusions can we draw from the above three fires? Like it or not, the world needs a guarantor of security. And for the past 70 years, only the U.S. has had the national will and the resources to meet that need. Without a global security cop, the needed economic development to provide jobs and a minimal standard of living will be lacking in many parts of the world. And the result will likely be more turmoil and unrest. And unfortunately, we're now economically weaker. We have a shrinking military and a seeming lack of political will, meaning us, to play the global cop role any longer. And there's no replacement nation on the horizon. I mean, if we step back from this role, there's going to be a vacuum. My view is that the U.S. cannot shrink from this role. A stable and peaceful world is in our national interest. But to play that role any longer, the U.S. needs a comprehensive strategic vision for its place in the world. We actually have to know what we stand for and be able to articulate what we stand for. We need to maintain our technical leadership in the world. We need to match our spending to resources, and we need the political will and the leadership to carry through. My view is that the people of the United States would support such a vision if they had confidence in the political process to deliver. The world needs a strong America with a principled leadership and with a vibrant and growing economy. And we need it to support a strong and technically superior military in addition to fundamental needs. And by the way, the key to a vibrant and growing economy is technical innovation with an educated and globally competitive workforce. Lastly, we can never, ever forget that we live our lives in freedom in America because many people have sacrificed their lives for our freedom. I mean, think about that. It is astonishing, right? That people that you don't know us at all, people have given their lives for our freedom. So I just want to say God bless all those who have given their lives for our freedom and all those who have served, all the veterans and all those who are standing to watch today. Thank you. God bless you all.
Well, what a clarion call. I know that many of you in this room must have been moved by this speech, and you have lots of questions. So I want to open the floor now to questions for Secretary England. Questions? Yes, this gentleman right here.
I really appreciated what you had to say about culture matters, and I wanted to see if you had any ideas on how we could change the culture of Congress.
So it's all I will tell you is, first of all, we elect every member of Congress. And by the way, the Constitution defines how they operate, right? So it is our government. I mean, I think there is a fundamental question. I'm hopeful about this, but you still answer the question. I mean, government that was put together in basically 18th century, now in the 21st century, and so does it work the way people envisioned it would work? I had to comment before. My own view is, First of all, 535 members of Congress, right, House and Senate, they all come from different constituent groups, so they all have different views, and they all have to get elected. I mean, frankly, I think if you want to get something out of Congress, it really has to be leadership of the White House. I mean, I don't believe that Congress, as disparate as it is, and that's the way it's set up, I think on contentious issues, this could be really hard to get a consensus. So you have to have a leadership, and you have to be willing to get to a compromise position. It can't be an all or nothing. I mean, Washington is not that way. I know that. It's not that you give away your principles, but you have to move in the right direction. It doesn't mean you can do this in big steps, right? You have to be willing to take small steps. But hey, you know what? We elected, it's the Constitution. Welcome to America. I mean, that's...
I think Professor Takayuchi has a question.
Secretary Indran, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. I really agree with your argument that the world needs the United States. Having said that, it seems that in the domestic American politics, seems isolationism is rising, and then especially isolationists are better at using the new social media. So I'm not sure whether in reality isolationism is rising in the US, but at the same time, their voice is heard more. So having faced that challenge of the kind of seeming rise of the isolationism in the American domestic politics, how will and should the United States respond to the situation that the world still needs the United States?
So I would say, look, we're war weary, right? I mean, you know, this all started 9/11/01. You know, frankly, when I went into government, which was in May of '01, there was a whole different agenda. You know, I came in as Secretary of the Navy, and there was a whole different agenda. Secretary Rumsfeld had laid out. All of a sudden, 9/11 happened, and the world changed. And by the way, we're war weary. It's been going on for a long time. So I think the natural reaction is to step back. And you're right. You know, I think people who feel like we shouldn't be engaged have a stronger voice. But again, I think there's a leadership issue. I mean, if you step back from the world. I mean, if we pull back to our shores, there will be more insecurity in the world. There will be more turmoil. It will affect us directly as a nation. I mean, we will suffer our economic development, our insecurity, and it's a leadership issue. I think people, you know, present leadership of the country needs to articulate why this is important to us, to everybody in America. I mean, our economic situation is not going to improve with turmoil in the world. The best thing that happened to us is a peaceful world with lots of trade, exports, et cetera, right? Turmoil in the world is not in our security or economic interests, and so we need to articulate that. And by the way, leadership is not about being popular. It always bothers me. They're always publishing. Leadership is about, you know, taking the nation, and a lot of times in unpopular places, right, where it doesn't necessarily want to go. That's why you have leaders. It isn't about look at the next poll and make sure I'm popular sort of thing. So, look, I think, well, I've said it, right?
Colleague Admiral Patrick Walsh here.
Mr. Secretary, I probably speak for everyone here. We'd all be interested, if you're interested in a rematch with Washington, maybe one more trip.
No more. No more trips, Pat.
Could we just touch a little bit and elaborate on the theme of education? The OECD data that you quoted that showed our ranking for math and science and engineering, which...
No, secondary.
For secondary education, also would describe that we're the #1 country in the world in terms of how much money we put into education. Yet we have this very high level of dissatisfaction with the results that we're getting. Can you offer any ideas on first steps that we might take in reconsidering how we approach education?
So let's see, Jim Young, is he here? Jim Young. Okay, so Jim was talking to me earlier. In Dallas, we have charter schools. They're basically public schools, right? Anybody can go to them, serves a lot of minority kids, and they are hugely successful, and they don't spend any more money than any other school. And so, you know, a lot of minority children with disadvantaged backgrounds go to school. They come out, top students, they go to colleges, right? And they're very, so it's not, I mean, it's about the system that we have, I believe, rather than, but I'll tell you what, Americans tend to think if we throw money at something, it gets better. By the way, that is, the Washington approach to issues. Now, I will tell you, everything in Washington is just get more money and spend more money. If you spend less, by definition, it's worse. If you spend more, it's better. And I think that's our view of education. We keep spending more, Pat. I really do think you have to fundamentally change the education system. I frankly would like to see trade schools back again, right? I mean, we don't have shop in schools anymore, right? I mean, everybody doesn't get prepared for college, right? I mean, we ought to have trade and we ought to have projects. And I think there's all sorts of things you can do in the education system, but we better figure it out. And we better figure it out, because I'll tell you, it's not long. I mean, we're moving along quickly. You know, I mean, these aren't new rankings, right? We've been here for a long time. So I frankly think we're in a dire situation right now. There was a study by Norm Augustine, The Gathering Storm, right, National Academy publication. And that was now about 5 years ago, and there's been an update, and not a whole lot has changed in that period of time.
I want to take a question from this side over here, Dr. Liz Colton. And the students, we got 2 tables of students here. You guys need to start thinking about your questions.
Thank you very much. It's a very dismal view in lots of ways, but I think it's terribly important. I wish you would take your speech all over the country. But what I wanted to ask, since you've been on different floors of the Pentagon and the decks, what can be done right now with the austerity that we have, or sort of mitigating against the complete negativity and pessimism that I'm sure is prevailing, I know is prevailing in the Pentagon, of how to deal with all this?
Okay, so I'll give you Gordon England's view. First of all, sequestration's bad because it mandates cuts across the board. Budget reduction is not bad. I mean, frankly, the only way government agencies become more efficient is to cut off the blood supply. I mean, inherently, they will grow. The Pentagon has 800,000 civilian employees. So Army, Air Force, Marines all have, Navy, all have more civilians than there are United States Marines. And I'd much rather go to war with the United States Marines than with civilians, right? I mean, actually, so there were 700,000, it grew to 800,000, and now it's 800,000, and we haven't reduced one single civilian in the Department of Defense, but we are reducing the military and we're reducing the equipment, and so I don't know why that's not happening. I mean, I frankly am not against reducing the military budget. It grew dramatically during the war. The war's over. It can be cut back. But I do think you have to cut it where it should be cut and not just, you know, cut off arms and legs of the military, which seems to be the approach right now. So I'm critical of the way it's happening. I mean, and by the way, when Secretary Panetta came and actually wrote a letter to the New York Times or Journal or something and said, gee, Mr. Secretary, if I were you, here's what I'd do. And I said I would immediately reduce 100,000 civilians, because you're not going to be able to afford to keep them. And now I'd raise that to 200,000.
Wow. There's a challenge. I see you have a student right here. George, you want to ask a question on behalf of your generation?
So first, I want to thank you for being here and for sharing your insight. And I guess I've got a twofold question. It's kind of a bigger picture. So growing up, what was the best piece of advice that you were ever given? And then second, what kind of advice would you have for the current students in your room?
What the best advice is, what's the second question?
I'm sorry.
Turn on that mic. There you go.
There we go.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Everybody up.
So I guess to repeat my question. So first question was, in terms of the bigger picture, what was the best piece of advice that you were given growing up? And then secondly, for the students in this room, you know, what advice would you have for us as we go into the real world?
So first of all, I'll tell you, my mother and dad, neither one finished the 8th grade, because back then you had to go to work, right? But God bless them. I mean, they knew that the path to doing better in life was to get an education, right? So, I mean, that's constantly was make sure you go to college. And And so I did that. By the way, when I was in high school, this affects my thinking about education, Pat. When I was in high school, they still had World War II equipment in high schools. And you could stay after school and learn to be a ham radio operator. So I would stay after school and learn to be a ham radio operator, W3AWO. And at that time, it was sort of a big deal. You could transmit Morse code around the world and contact people, and it's not like it is now. It was pretty neat to be able to do all that. I don't know, I became an electrical engineer, right? So I had experience in high school pretty young that influenced my career. And so I tell you, the best advice was, like most people, their parents. But right now I tell young people, and they need to go into a technical field. I mean, some sort of technical field. The future is technical. I mean, we think we're in a technical society, and we ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, look, it's going to just gallop, and it changes dramatically. So I get technical magazines in my house. I told my wife the other day, I said, I don't even understand half the articles, 2/3 of them sometimes, even what the subject is, because the technology moves so quickly, right? I don't see how people can manage or do anything going forward if they don't have some technical knowledge of what's going on in their company or, right, their enterprise. So
We've got just a few minutes left, and I'm going to go around the room pretty quickly here to see if Dr. Annie Wong and the student and Bill Barnett, and we'll take a couple more questions here. So make your questions quick.
Is with regards to the use of contractors versus civil servants. In your decades of experience in the government, especially your time in DoD, one of the biggest users of contractors, what insights have you gained, and where do you strike the balance, especially when we talk about in times of budgetary constraints? It seems to swing from one end to the other between administrations. Thank you.
Unfortunately, you're right. I mean, it's largely a political decision. I mean, there's no question, right? Contractors in almost every case are less expensive than government employees. So if you want to reduce costs, you outsource to contractors, less expensive. That said, there are inherently government functions that require government employees. So, for those inherently government functions, I think procurement's in that category, evaluations, et cetera. You definitely want government employees. Otherwise, we should be outsourcing. And then when you want to cut back, by the way, you just let those employees go. It's very, very difficult to let, a government employee go. It's almost impossible, as a matter of fact.
Yeah,
but no, I think outsourcing. But it ebbs and flows depending on who's in power and sort of what the political outlook is for whoever's politically in power.
Go quickly. The student here, and then Bill. And then we'll take a couple more questions.
Thank you very much, sir. My question pertains to the Joint Strike Fighter and how it is one plane that's supposed to satisfy the mission of all three branches.
The Joint Strike Fighter?
What is your opinion on having a single piece of technology that's supposed to satisfy three dynamically different missions of military?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
What is your opinion on having one piece of technology that's supposed to satisfy the different demands of each branch?
One piece of technology is supposed to satisfy the demands of all three branches.
Okay, so I'm a big supporter of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and frankly, I'm probably the guy who kept it alive in the Pentagon early on because Air Force wanted F-22, and I really wanted to go to F-35, and so probably had a big role in keeping F-35 in place. It's really not one airplane. It's really three different airplanes, different wings on the Navy airplane. But they do have common propulsion, they do have common avionics, so the things are expensive, particularly from a support point of view, are common. But, we have the vertical takeoff, short takeoff and landing for the Marine Corps. So the airplanes are different, but the components are very similar to about 80% level, which makes each airplane less expensive and the support cost dramatically less. But I'm a proponent. I think you have to have something like F-35.
Bill Barnett?
Let me make sure, is this working?
Yep, it's on.
Very good. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Secretary. One of your main themes was that we need leadership, and I certainly agree that leadership is a good thing. As I think about military leadership in my lifetime, at least, there have been three major commitments of U.S. military forces around the world. There's Korea, there's Vietnam, and there's Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you look at those, Korea was sort of an in-between result. Vietnam was a bad result. We didn't win the war, and the Soviet Union caught up in a whole lot of military categories. In both cases, we ended up war-weary. And now we've got the Iraq war that leads to a stronger Iran and an uncertain result in Iraq, and Afghanistan is not clear. And so I wonder whether leadership has to mean a strong, aggressive commitment of military power, and whether that's useful, or alternatively, it's a more cautious, very thoughtful commitment of military power, and that's where the true leadership is, whether it's popular or not. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
So I guess my first view is, I come down on either of those sides. I guess what bothers me, I believe indecisive leadership, probably an oxymoron, right, is probably the worst of all worlds, right? So not knowing what it is you're doing and sending that message, I think, is probably the worst of three situations. War, indecisiveness, no war sort of thing is probably the worst of all worlds. I think when Kissinger was in China many years ago, I forget who the Chinese leader was, but the conversation got around to the French Revolution, and the Chinese leader said about the outcome, and he said, well, it's too early to tell. Yeah. So, you know, well, there's something to that, because we tend to look at results pretty quickly, right, in terms of what the outcomes are. I mean, you may not know the outcome in the Middle East for a couple generations, maybe even more. I mean, it turns out that the Arab Spring, probably a bad name, but, you know, they actually paid attention when people voted in Iraq, right, that people actually started to have a say. And so I think these are long-term issues. And by the way, Korea, I'm going to next week talk at the chamber, right, Jimmy? And Korea is really, that's, pardon? Oh, Rotary Club, I'm sorry, Rotary Club, and really it's Korea, so I've sort of been thinking about Korea. So look, I'm not sure, right? I mean, nobody knows what's right or wrong in that, right? It's sort of history decides many, many years later. And, but I do think that leadership needs to send strong messages. I think if not sending strong messages, being very indecisive, I think is the worst thing you can do in terms of leadership.
Okay, I'm going to try to take as many questions as I can here. We're going to end it pretty quickly, maybe a couple more. This gentleman over here was waiting, and then General Williams, and I think we had one question over here.
We won't need a conference tomorrow, will we?
It seems as though there's been a number of major military programs that have suffered from shifting requirements and have suffered as a result. And I think we've seen some examples of other branches of the government lately with problems with that. Do you have suggestions how the Pentagon and other branches of the government might do a better job of managing major programs?
So make sure, tell me again, I missed part of it.
You want to repeat the essence of the question?
I was curious to know if you had suggestions on how the Pentagon and other major departments of the government would be able to do better jobs of managing programs. It seems shifting requirements and things like that have been a problem.
So I'll tell you, it all gets down to personnel, right? I mean, programs are no better than the people who run them, and I think government's same place as industry, right? I mean, if you don't get top people, it's hard to run a program successfully. Very successful programs have terrific procurement managers, good technical people, right? And contractors are the same way. Invariably, on a troubled program, it's because you just don't have the grade A quality people you need for very difficult programs. And I think that's true in industry and government. And it's particularly true if you don't have the grade A team on both sides of this. But I mean, every program I looked at in government, I mean, when these programs are in trouble, it's because, you know, we didn't have the right quality people, right kind of experience, background, decision-making, right, hadn't been there before, right? I mean, it gets down to the people. Congress asked me one time what kind of regulations I would recommend to, quote, fix the procurement system. I don't think you can, quote, fix the procurement system. And this is not about regulations. It's about the top quality people you have to be able to attract to government, and that's hard to do, by the way.
Well, I think we only have time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to take one from General Williams here, and then gentleman over here.
Mr. Secretary, you had mentioned China a little bit, but I wanted to see if you could give us a little opinion of, you know, the last 50 years, they've kind of had a hegemonic move in Africa, the Middle East, South America, and I was wondering what you thought about that, and also, does the 900 million poor people in China give you a concern?
So, you know, when Jim Jones, General Jim Jones, former commandant, when he was SACEUR, right, you know, he was running all of Europe, and at the time, that included all of Africa, and he kept saying, boy, we are missing out on Africa, you know, that's, he said, you go down to Africa, there's Chinese everywhere in Africa, and they're, you know, providing aid and helping to do things and building businesses, and there's nobody. You know, you hardly see any Americans in all of Africa. That was probably 2007 or something like that, right? So I don't know if that circumstance has changed a lot, but you really don't hear a lot about interest in Africa here in the United States a whole lot, and it's pretty obvious the Chinese have great interest in Africa, a lot of natural resources and thing. And by the way, economies are growing in a lot of Africa. Among the turmoil, there's some countries doing well, right? What was the second part about 900?
900, does the 900 million poor people in China give you concern?
Oh, yeah. No, look, China, I mean, that's the other part of this. You know, we forget that China is actually a very poor country. I mean, the average income in China is what, about $5,000 a year, some less than $5,000 a year. We're like 40,000. So, I mean, they're just a fraction of the United States, which, by the way, does tell you that they could have huge economic growth, right, internally. I mean, if they ever turn this, which they're trying to do inwardly, right, rather than exports, but, you know, like 70% of our economy is domestic, right? I mean, if China ever got to 70% domestic, they would have one enormous economic system, right? Now, the question is, though, can they keep their, quote, economic system going? I mean, you know, they have fundamental flaws. I mean, they also have huge waste and a lot of corruption, and I mean, their system's not something we would ever want to emulate. So, I mean, will it survive as we know? I think it's a fundamental question, General. But no, they got it. I mean, it's still a poor country, and they still have a lot of social issues. One time I was asked, I was with the ambassador of Singapore at a dinner, and she always sort of named a topic that we would discuss. And the topic was India versus China. And I actually said long term, I thought India would prevail for the simple reasons because in India you vote. And voting is actually a safety valve. So all the friction that builds up in society, you know, that vote is a safety valve, and it relieves a lot of friction in the system. So China doesn't have that safety valve. And I think in China, the friction builds, right? I think friction's still building, right? Particularly in this day of internet and freer, and, you know, students come here and they go home. And so no, I think there's going to be a lot of friction in China before this is over. It's not in our interest, by the way. We like to have a very peaceful China, developed, exports, import, you know, but their form of government, keep in mind, is not really compatible with our thinking.
I think it's appropriate the last question from a student. We're going to wrap it up. Yep, last question.
I have a question.
It's on. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question that I think that if you think about the question just grammatically, it's very simple, but if you think about it in context, hopefully it lends more to it. But I'm curious to know, do you, and as well as the rest of people here, feel like the United States people are ready for a strong leader? Not questioning whether we need one or not, but how would people react to that, sort of a super president? Because we've had so many people that seems these days some people are not so fascinated with who the president is now. We're not so fascinated with who our leader is. Do you feel like the United States, our people, our voters are ready for a big personality, a bold personality that can lead us in the right direction
who we feel the ripples of what they have done for 30, 40, 50 years after their term of office in Washington?
Nice, easy question.
So, my view is the U.S. is basically now run by a political class, right? I mean, people become politicians, and not many other people enter into that realm anymore. Congressmen eventually become senators, and senators run for president, and sons and daughters of people who are out run for office. I mean, literally, we've almost become a political class in America, which I think is very unhealthy, by the way. But it's onerous and it's expensive and all that to get into American politics. So I guess I would answer your question. I'm not sure we can elect a really powerful leader. I'm not sure the system lets such a person, prevail in the political process. So that's the last question. So my last comment is, I'm actually not pessimistic. When you look at America, we're far better than everybody else in the world. But it does worry me that we are on some bad trend lines, that if we don't fix them, it will not be good for our kids and grandkids. First of all, we're a huge economic system, and a lot of people, and enormous momentum. And probably if nobody did anything, it'd continue for a long time on its own, right? So, but that isn't the way it should be. It should be a dynamic, vibrant opportunity for all, and for everybody. Even that third, we shouldn't have a third of our kids not going to school. We really ought to find ways to address these issues and do it before they become bigger and more turmoil and discord and all that, right? So I'm not pessimistic. I'm just sort of sounding the clarion that says we better start paying attention because things will get worse rather than get better, and we owe it to everybody to make this even a better country on the face of the earth. We owe it to the world, by the way. There's no other country like the United States, and every country in the world looks to us for leadership, and we better be in a position to do that. Okay, God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'll hope to see you tomorrow. Thank Secretary for his leadership.